Oh, G Rose, and today we're going to be talking about concerning epistemology on why freedom is improbable as featured in Second Thoughts. The paper is going to be discussing how worry creates its own evidence. There's a number of papers in OG Rose that discusses and explores the worry, fear, anxiety, and how these things structure reality toward us in such a manner that really makes them inescapable. The way that they formulate phenomenon as evidence toward their case, the way they allow us to always relate and interpret the world in a manner that can never falsify it. It really is a self-relating, self-enclosed problem. And this creates, this can really make it to where if one is worried about, there's nothing they can do to escape that worry. And this is really quite problematic. So, imagine if you and I are sitting in a kitchen and there is a door nearby, and I ask you not to open it because there might be a murderer on the other side. But of course, the only sure way to prove that my concern is irrational is by opening the door and risking death. If you do open it and find no one there, I could be emotionally hurt because you didn't heed my instruction, making you feel like you made the wrong choice for putting your life at risk and for so carelessly disregarding my concerns for your well-being. What would you have lost by not opening the door? You wouldn't have needlessly put your life in jeopardy. Furthermore, you wouldn't have hurt my feelings and disrespected my wishes. By taking a risk, you gained nothing and lost my confidence. You kept your freedom, but hurt me and risked your own life. And you accomplished making me have reason to worry about you, precisely because you proved to be someone who won't heed my warning. So you see how in that example, if you open the door, you're irrational and thus should be worried about. But of course, if you don't open the door, you can always imagine that there was someone there, and therefore it was a good decision not to open the door. And of course, if you got up and opened the door and there was nobody behind it, well, the murderer just moved. They just went away. And you can't prove that there wasn't a murderer behind it maybe 10 minutes earlier, right? So there's always a way to interpret, no matter what happens, in a manner to where the worry doesn't have to be overturned or falsified or proven to be unfounded. The worrier can always interpret the situation in their favor, no matter how things go. Now, another example the paper will explore is if a child, like a 15-year-old, wants to go climb a mountain. And let's say the father decides he's not able to go and says, no, you shouldn't go. Well, if the child never climbs the mountain, then the child never is given an opportunity to prove that he can climb the mountain, and it can never be said for sure that the father didn't save the child from hurting himself, right? And then if the child doesn't climb the mountain, the very fact that the father put in his head that he would have gotten hurt can then, the child doesn't experience a world where he doesn't get hurt, so he can always imagine that he would have gotten hurt. And it goes, and also if the child is adamant that he won't get hurt and that he should be allowed to climb the mountain, and let's say he goes off and just does it anyway, well, he's proven he's irresponsible and that the father should worry about him. And just because he didn't get hurt this time doesn't mean he won't get hurt the next time. And so again, once a person worries, everything can be spun in favor of the worry. There's nothing anyone can do to escape it. And so you see, there's reason to think that the worrier wins by default. And also, too, the worrier can always be like, I'm only worried about you because I love you. So then, if you go against the worrier, say, tell the worrier not to worry about you, that can be hurtful and lead to a lot of drama and a lot of problems. And you really can see in these examples that there's no way to escape the worry or the way the worrier has defined the situation without risking emotional damage or without hurting the relationship. And so the person that's worried about is kind of like thrown into a world they didn't ask to be thrown about that they cannot readily escape. And it's really almost as if the worrier wins by default, unless people just recognize the way that worry structures reality so that worry wins by default. And you can really almost say that freedom in general is at the mercy of worry. Like once worry enters the picture, what can freedom do? If freedom opens the door, the murderer example, well, that doesn't necessarily legitimize freedom, because you can always say that the murderer just left. If the child freely goes and climbs the mountain, well, the parents can just say, well, you were okay that time, but next time you won't be. So worry, like freedom, And I'm not trying to say, this paper is going to be kind of comparing worry and freedom. This is not to say that freedom is always good or freedom is always best. It has to be situated in a concert of variables and values, as often comes up, like in that conversation with Ethan Nelson or different things. So this is not trying to argue that freedom is always good, but we are trying to say that the way that worry structures reality toward us hurts discernment, or it makes it more difficult to discern, precisely because it creates this self-enclosure. Basically, worry just has to stop. Like, it can't, like, if worry is like, well, I'm going to worry until I see evidence not to worry, then it's always going to happen, and then freedom will be devoured. Like, freedom can't do anything. The worry is going to self-justify itself, and freedom will be contained, deconstructed, and so on. Worry seems to be a self-contained, self-justifying epistemological system. And this is like concerning epistemology. It's concerning that you have something that can create an epistemological structure like that. And anything that freedom does or reveals can be interpreted in favor, not of freedom, but of worry. And so, this applies on the individual level, but also on the social level. I mean, once a society chooses to worry, what constitutes rational and loving to the society will be that which annuls freedom. The choice to worry is the choice to make freedom irrational. The only way freedom can be rational is if people choose not to worry. But why shouldn't they worry? Can't something bad happen? Isn't it possible that my son will hurt himself if he climbs the mountain? You see, there's just not a rational reason not to worry. Now, throughout O.G. Rose, we talk a lot about non-rationality. And so there's a way in which not worrying seems irrational, but really it's non-rational, meaning it solves a Nash equilibrium situation. Now, that's not really discussed a lot in the paper, but that is something that comes up often in O.G. Rose. And indeed, worry seems to create a situation where if everyone acts rationally, you get a suboptimal result. Yeah, because the rationality is defined by the worry in such a manner that contributes to kind of the self-enclosure, the way it closes itself off. And, Trey has talked about kind of self-relating negativity, Zizek, Hegel, all that is a kind of way the subject relates to itself in a manner that leads to hell, and that hell is kind of locked from the inside, as Lewis will put it. Well, it's interesting, if indeed fear and worry and anxiety do something similar, as this paper is arguing, then maybe it's not by chance that you see in the gospel Jesus is just perpetually saying, be not afraid, be not afraid, be not afraid, be not afraid. Because fear just seems to have this way to enclose us in something we cannot escape. The worrier always makes reality and phenomenon toward the worrier in such a way that freedom is never the right choice. And if a society worries, it will skew its discernment and blind itself on the fruits of liberty. So, free markets it's not always best to remove regulation, in my opinion, from the market. But if you're worrying, the likelihood you'll be able to accurately discern when you should remove regulation and when you should not is going to be very, very low, because worry is going to automatically win. Or interpret the situation far more in its favor than freedom. Freedom, like what people do with their freedom, is not discernible ahead of time, but you can always come up with bad things that might happen, right? So it's easier to imagine the negatives, bad things happening, than it is to imagine how people use freedom. In fact, freedom by definition is that thing you cannot imagine, because people are free. If you can imagine it, well, they must not be so free, right? So worry has an advantage that way, in which it's easier to kind of think of bad things happening and harder to think of how people use their freedom. So that leads to a mental image of a kind of vividness of worry. And then the fact that you feel worry so much, and then indeed you worry about how people use their freedom, and stuff gets bad, and that also all points to the Grand Inquisitor section. So it's really, really important, if we're going to discern when we should increase freedom, we should not increase freedom, when we should have regulation, not, and you could go into any issue, that we need to recognize the self-justifying nature of worry, fear, and anxiety. Paper is also going to say we have to make a distinction between worry and wisdom. Fear and wisdom is one of the most important distinctions we can make, and yet it's one of the hardest distinctions to make. But that's a really important subject as well. And the paper will also critique ideas like better safe than sorry. Sometimes being safe is to be sorry, so it's not so simple. It is going to acknowledge that gray zone on determining when we should increase freedom and not, but I also think it's often easier to tell what we should do in the situation. Like if you're actually in the situation, discerning from particular particularities. It's not always so gray, and that's a note of hope. But mainly, the paper, it hopes to bring to our attention how worry justifies itself and closes itself, so we might get better at not being controlled by it. And to also just understand that the only way to escape worry and fear is to stop. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, and so on. And thank you so much for your time.